Ladies and gentlemen, Karen Karpovich, Executive Director of the English-Speaking Union.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have the distinct honor of making a special announcement tonight ahead of our program on President Eisenhower, Chairman of the English-Speaking Union from 1963 to 1966. At a special board meeting this afternoon, the ESU Board of Directors accepted Dr. Paul Beresford Hill's retirement and resignation as chairman of the board, having served his full 6 years. Dr. Beresford Hill will continue to be deeply engaged in the ESU, specifically leading the organization's activities as the NGO with special consultative status at the United Nations. The board extends its deepest gratitude to Dr. Paul Beresford Hill for his many contributions and looks forward to his continued involvement and valued counsel. I am also pleased to announce that under the recommendation of the nominating committee, the ESU board unanimously voted to appoint current ESU president, Dr. Quinn Pieper, as chairman of the English-Speaking Union of the United States, effective immediately. Additionally, Daryl McCormick was elected vice chair, and Duncan Karcher was elected president of the English-Speaking Union. The ESU congratulates Dr. Pieper, Mr. McCormick, and Mr. Karcher, and looks forward to working with them for the success of the organization. Everyone, Dr. Pieper.
Thank you, Karen. And my sincerest thanks and appreciation to my fellow members of the Board of Directors. I'm humbled and honored that you have entrusted me with this responsibility. And I pledge to do my utmost as chairman to warrant this trust, confidence, and support. Taking the reins at this time is made easier by the work laid by Dr. Paul Beresford Hill over the past 6 years. Despite the challenges, Paul brought our board and membership together and stayed focused on the fundamental strengths of our organization, our mission, our members, and our programs. Paul, I thank you. Before I begin this afternoon, there are 5 board members rotating off or leaving this year. I would like to recognize these members for their service. Dr. Paul Beresford Hill, John Raffelli, Robin Sinclair, Julia Hansen, and Donna Miller. Thank you so much for your service. I am conscious of the impressive legacy left by the ESU leaders during a 100-year-long history. In fact, the program of this conference over the past 3 days reminded all of us of the organization's illustrious past, its incredible accomplishments, the difference it's made in the world, and most importantly, the role its leaders have played. A union for all seasons, learning from the past, looking to the future, summarizes so well my charge as the new chairman. I am very grateful that I'm following in a proud tradition and that I am standing on the shoulder of giants. And tonight, during our final evening of the 101st English-Speaking Union Annual General Conference, we will consider the legacy of one such giant, President Dwight David Eisenhower. President Eisenhower led the ESU during a tumultuous time from 1963 to 1966. During his first board meeting, when he took on the chairmanship, here is what he said. At one of the very last meetings I had right after the war, with Sir Winston Churchill and myself included, there was a sort of roundtable discussion for the future of most of us. All wanted to rest, but without exception, there was the feeling that only in every possible movement that would keep the English-speaking peoples allied, only in this way, could much broader conception of keeping the UN working and so on be accomplished. In time of war, the union between the two peoples was something to stand as a model for all future coalitions. And I wish now we could translate it all into NATO. But I say this just to assure you of my very deep and abiding hope that not only will the money be coming in for your program, but I would like to see us grow. I believe that there is great work to be done, and various other organizations are trying to do some of the same things. So long as we are pulling and harnessed together and in the same direction, we will get certain satisfaction of doing our part, not just as citizens of the United States, but of the world, trying to make of the ESU a base on which this larger campaign can be more effective. What a recognition of the ESU's place in maintaining friendly relations, not only between English-speaking nations, but through the network of international ESUs with all countries in the world. Commanding general of the victorious forces in Europe during World War II and a two-term president of the United States, Ike had a unique perspective on the importance of the United States-United Kingdom alliance on peaceful cooperation and democracy. With us tonight are ESU Executive Director Karen Karpowicz and Dr. Andrew J. Polsky, Professor of Political Science at Hunter College and the Graduate Center. Ms. Karpowicz will interview Dr. Polsky about President Eisenhower's legacy, his post-war leadership, and how the changing political landscape affected his decision-making, drawing lessons for all of us. Dr. Polsky has done extensive research and published articles and books on the Eisenhower administration. His most recent research article, Shifting Currents, Dwight Eisenhower and the Dynamic of Presidential Opportunity Structure, draws lessons from Ike's presidency. Professor Polsky is also author of Elusive Victories, The American Presidency at War, published by Oxford University Press, 2012, and The Rise of the Therapeutic State, Princeton University Press, 1991, and editor of the Eisenhower Presidency, Lessons for the 21st Century, Lexington Books, 2015. A scholar of American political development and the presidency, his articles have appeared in such journals as Perspectives on Politics, Studies in American Political Development, American Politics Research, Journal of Theoretical Politics, and Political Science Quarterly. From 2005 to 2010, Dr. Polsky served as editor of the political science journal Polity. He has also twice been elected chair of the Hunter College Political Science Department. Dr. Polsky received his PhD in politics from Princeton University. Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Karen Karpowicz and Dr. Andrew Polsky.
The Fireside Chat at number 10 Downing Street.
In our lifetime, we've been pretty close together, our countries. Of course, there have been differences, and it's no good denying them. There have been serious differences before the war, after the war, 2 or 3 years ago about the Middle East, sometimes about the Far East. Now we're up against the biggest job in the world, how to keep peace and justice.
Well, Harold, I think there's one thing we should be very sure about. When we're talking about peace, we're talking about something now that's the imperative of our time. War has become so threatening in its capacity for destruction of a whole civilization that we, and I mean all people as well as statesmen, have the responsibility of making sure that our actions are, the things we try to do, are all directed by this single purpose and directed with as much intelligence as we can marshal within such brains as the good Lord gave us.
Winfield House, London, and an early arrival for the reunion dinner with Sir Winston Churchill, Ike's guest of honor. Now, Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Lord Tedder. Field Marshal Earl Alexander of Tunis. Field Marshal Viscount Montgomery of Alamein, arriving to meet Ike again in spite of those criticisms. And the Prime Minister, for 17 years a friend of General, now President Eisenhower. It was almost like a history of World War II, seen through the personalities of the men who planned and fought for Allied victory. Meeting to talk about those days just 20 years after the war began. Monty was clearly in his usual good form, almost as if he were planning a new campaign. Mr. Macmillan insisted on bringing Earl Alexander into the picture. Then he took one arm of the settee, while Field Marshal Viscount Allenbrook, the former CIGS, took the other. A wonderful get-together, this dinner on the eve of Ike's departure.
So finally, may I just say this one word. God save your gracious Queen and all her people.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful group of clips. I think you know that Professor Polsky, that our conference, as our entire conference, was around leadership and styles of leadership, and being a 100-year-old organization, as you can imagine, we had all kinds of leaders. And I think all of us feel like Eisenhower was one of our top leaders, but in a very curious time for both the United States, the world, and the ESU. I wanted to start with something. It was a treasure finding that quote from his address to the opening of the first board meeting as chairman. And I wanted to pull something out of there which had a particular resonance for me, because I thought it illustrated a lot about Eisenhower. And it was a quote that said in that speech to the board of the ESU, "In a time of war, the union between two peoples was something to stand as a model for all future coalitions. And I wish now that we could translate that into NATO." And he also references NATO, but he also references the United Nations. And I guess my question is that how do you, the dichotomy of that, meaning that here he was a leader of wartime, yet here he was leading in a time when he was asked probably not to be that, but to be something else. Could you talk a little bit about that?
First of all, thank you for having me this evening, and thank you to Quinn Pieper for that generous introduction. I think Eisenhower is a fascinating leader, both as a military commander, but also as a president of the United States. One who has come to be recognized as a much better president over the course of time when historians have looked back than he was thought to be at the time he was in office and right after he left office, when in general he was held in fairly low esteem, at least by intellectuals, as someone who hadn't really measured up to the office and what the office required. I think now we see that, in fact, he was able to adapt to the circumstances. He was a generally effective president at the time, recognizing what he could and couldn't do, which is, to me, is a very important quality of leadership. And I think he understood that wartime circumstances drew people together in ways and created unity both internally and across an alliance in ways that really weren't possible, much as he might like, but weren't possible in peacetime. He worked very hard to maintain those alliances. He was very serious about his commitment to the United Nations and to NATO. These institutions he felt were critically important in the modern world, especially as means to avoid at least a global war, if not other wars.
At that time, at the end of his tenure as president, was a summit between Nikita Khrushchev, England, and France. And I guess it was an important summit at the time. And the thing that kind of struck me when I read about it was the fact that we had the summit, and then at the same time, we had the Francis Gary Powers incident over Russia. And I guess historically, I always thought that Powers was part of the Kennedy administration. I never realized that it was the tail end of the Eisenhower administration. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Right. So we associate détente, the reduction of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, with a later president, basically with Richard Nixon in the 1970s. Even Lyndon Johnson in the mid-1960s was moving in that direction. Eisenhower wanted to do it earlier. Eisenhower was hoping near the end of his term, with Khrushchev in office now in the Soviet Union, that it would be possible for the United States and the Soviet Union, in conjunction with France and Great Britain, to lower the tensions that existed in the world. Everyone knew that both sides had significant nuclear arsenals. Everyone was concerned about the possibility that nuclear war could break out at any point. Eisenhower wanted to reduce those tensions, but he also wanted to have a very clear grasp of what Soviet capabilities were. He wanted to go into the conference with the Russians fully aware of what their missiles could do and how far advanced they were. So the United States had been conducting U-2 overflights of the Soviet Union for several years, and the Soviets had protested quietly about it. They didn't want to acknowledge that the plane flew too high for them to shoot down at that point. Eisenhower decided he wanted just one last flight, U-2 flight, to confirm the status of Russian missiles. At that point, of course, Soviet air defense capabilities had improved. They shot the plane down. The Americans hoped very much that Powers had been killed when it went down, so they would be able to deny any responsibility and essentially deny the whole thing. But Powers lived. He became a considerable embarrassment. And for Russian hardliners, any talk of détente represented softening towards the United States that was unacceptable to them. And they pushed Khrushchev to take a much harder line. That basically derailed any possibility of détente. So here is Eisenhower making a decision to send a U-2 flight over Russia late in his term, and essentially ruins the possibility of a major breakthrough in relations with the Soviet Union. Presidential leadership is often about that. It's about actions that presidents take with unintended consequences, and then they have to deal with the consequences and the circumstances that the consequences present for them.
So that, I think one of the things that you also mentioned in your essay in your book is the notion of the context of the time. I guess this really extends more. Could you talk a little bit more about the context? I know that you had the Soviet situation and the Cold War, but what else was it that was defining the context of his leadership or his presidency?
Well, if we look at Eisenhower's presidency, when he comes into office, and then we look at it 8 years later, the world is quite a different place. When Eisenhower becomes president, he takes office after winning the election in 1952. And he comes into office, he knows the war in Korea has been going on, it's long, it's unpopular. He's got to deal with that. He has to deal with expectations that people have in the United States, conflicting expectations about whether the New Deal is going to continue, with Republican conservatives pressing him to undo some aspects of the New Deal. Knowing, though, that the country was still generally supportive of what Franklin Roosevelt had done in previous years. Civil rights was beginning to stir as an issue. The condition of the economy was an issue at the end of the Korean War. And then globally, he's dealing with a Middle East that is in which the United States at that point is still a relatively minor player. The French are engaged in a long war in Indochina, which is going badly for them. That's 1953. Now go forward 6, 7, 8 years later, late in Eisenhower's term, the United States has become a major player in the Middle East. The United States has assumed responsibility for the security of the new country of South Vietnam since the French have left. The Korean War is over. Civil rights is far more prominent as an issue in the United States because of Brown versus the Board of Education, and because of the Little Rock school crisis. It's a quite different world. And I think that one of the things we have to appreciate about presidents in particular is that circumstances are going to change significantly over the course of their term in office, especially if they last 2 terms. And the opportunities for acting will change dramatically over the course of those 8 years.
I guess the other question that kind of follows along in that is the whole notion of the New Deal. And I think I mentioned to you in our early discussion that I was the daughter of 2 New Deal Democrats that voted for Eisenhower. And so I guess talk about that resonance that New Deal Dems had for Eisenhower that got him elected and made him a popular president.
Well, I too, we were talking about this earlier. I'm the child of Democrats as well. My father loved Adlai Stevenson. He thought Eisenhower was a totally incompetent, inept, and bumbling figure who couldn't string together 2 coherent sentences in a row. Now, we know better than that, of course. Eisenhower as a leader understood something that other leaders generally understand well, which is leadership is part performance. And Eisenhower knew how to perform leadership. If he went to a press conference and he stumbled through that press conference, it was because he wanted to do that. It served his purposes in many ways. So Eisenhower comes into office. It's 1953. Americans have gotten used to Social Security and other New Deal innovations. In a well-known letter that Eisenhower wrote to his brother, who was more conservative than he was and who was pressing Eisenhower to undo the New Deal, Dwight Eisenhower says very clearly, any party that tries to do away with Social Security and the farm subsidies and all the rest that goes with the New Deal, any party that does that will soon disappear as a political party in the United States, never to be heard from again. We later came to call Social Security the 3rd rail of American politics. And politicians touch it at their greatest peril. George W. Bush talked about privatizing Social Security and got a political bloody nose for it. So Eisenhower, what he understood was Americans, although they may have been tired of some aspects of the New Deal, for example, people felt that organized labor had gotten too strong and there had been the Taft-Hartley Act to roll back some of the powers of organized labor. But Americans were very comfortable with the responsibility of government, to use a phrase that an earlier political scientist once coined, the president is the manager of prosperity. There was no longer the possibility the president of the United States could ignore the general performance of the economy. That had disappeared with Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. And whether you were a conservative or a liberal, you were going to be responsible for managing the American economy so that unemployment stayed low and inflation didn't get out of control. Those were some of Eisenhower's key responsibilities as an economic manager during his time in office. He knew that, he understood that. And he was prepared to accept that responsibility as president, even though he was a Republican.
So how did that define itself with regard to his pragmatism, with regard to financial pragmatism? Because that's also mentioned in his address to the new board of his new chairmanship at the ESU. You mentioned before that he was very conscious of the cost of financial responsibility in any kind of situations, especially any kind of war or conflict. Could you talk about that?
Eisenhower believed that the underlying national security of the United States rested upon the strength of its economy. You could always mobilize resources in the event of war, but you had to have that essential functioning economic strength if the United States was to be a superpower. And he understood that it was an advantage, an enormous advantage the United States had over the Soviet Union, whose economy was limping along all through the 1950s. When he cautions later on against the excessive influence of the military-industrial complex, it's against the backdrop of knowing that Americans, though they were deeply alarmed about the threats to our national security, also had to be cautious about not overspending and overinvesting in defense at the expense of economic prosperity, because ultimately that prosperity was crucial to the health of the United States. Within that general framework, As a conservative or moderate Republican in that era, Eisenhower believed in balanced budgets, which were not particularly difficult to maintain at that time. He was cautious about intervening in the economy, but influenced by the people around him, by his advisors when there were recessions in terms of what he should do. So as a general, you could describe Eisenhower in general as being a steward of the economy, understanding that the national government had a role to play without being directive or dictating too much in any particular economic area.
So how does that, I guess the connecting the dots for me with regard to that is this statement in the 60s on the military industrial complex. And then the fact that in the 50s, he chose not to go into Vietnam. He chose not to go into the Indochina. And then toward the end of his tenure, particularly around LBJ, he did support LBJ into going into Vietnam. So how do you kind of explain that?
So Eisenhower was, not surprisingly, a Cold Warrior. He saw communism as an aggressive ideology trying to expand its reach across parts of the globe. During the war, after the war, of course, Stalin had brought down the Iron Curtain in Eastern Europe. China had fallen under a communist government. There had been an invasion of South Korea by communist forces from the north. So there were signs of communist aggression that he as a Cold Warrior thought about. But he also understood that colonialism was a dying political system. The British had quit India. They were quitting other areas. The French were clinging in Indochina and giving only a slight facade of independence to the government, to the colonial governments in Indochina. And Eisenhower, having just extricated the United States from Korea in 1953 and 1954, faced the ultimate crisis for the French in Indochina. Their forces had been besieged at Dien Bien Phu. They were on the verge of defeat in early 1954. It looked like another country might fall to the communists. And Eisenhower was approached to get into the war. He came close. To be clear about this, he came close. What Eisenhower didn't want to do was go in by himself. He didn't want to enter the war unilaterally. In fact, he asked the British if they would join him. He wanted members of Congress to support him. The members of Congress basically said, we're not going to do this unless the British and other allies are fully on board. They weren't. And so Eisenhower backed away and decided that the French he could not sustain the French in Indochina. So that was really, I think you would call that a reading of the circumstances. He understood the Americans were tired of a drawn out war in Asia, a continent which Americans knew little about and didn't feel was essential to their security by and large. He did not want another war as in Korea that would continue and be drawn out. And for all of those reasons, he didn't want to get too deeply into Vietnam. At that particular point, let's just say mid-1950s, the United States had some choices. I don't think there was ever a realistic chance it was going to quit Vietnam entirely. But what it did is it invested very heavily in the new leader of South Vietnam, President Diem, not a popular leader at the time. But once the United States invested in him, it was hard to back away from him. And he was called a defender of freedom and a defender of democracy. He was neither, but that wasn't really on the table for Vietnam at that time. And he kept a limited commitment to Vietnam through the rest of his term of office. He wasn't prepared to see Vietnam go communist. And there was never a point that I know of that he said we should turn our backs and walk away from the situation. So he was basically keeping his options open as best he could. He turned over a situation to Kennedy that was actually getting worse. And as we know from history from that point on, the United States became more deeply involved in Vietnam, especially when Lyndon Johnson became president. Eisenhower supported Johnson's decisions about escalation. He was still a Cold Warrior. he did not have to make those decisions. He correctly read the situation in the mid-1950s. He didn't need to send American troops in to preserve a South Vietnam that was anti-communist, but he felt by the mid-1960s that circumstances had changed. With Eisenhower, it's important always to recognize, I think, his adaptability, his willingness to recognize when circumstances changed.
I'm going to open this up, not at this particular moment. I have a few more. We're going to ask Andy a few more questions, but I want to open this up also to the audience. And if you could start putting your questions in the Q&A column when Andy and I finish speaking on these additional discussion points, I'd like it to open it up to a full discussion. So please feel free to start entering questions into the Q&A box, and we'll answer them at the end of the session. I wanted to, at the beginning of our session, and then you know this is the English Speaking Union, and our conference, as I mentioned before, was on leadership. And if you trace our leadership, it goes back to Ulin Wrench, who founded the ESU based on this need for global understanding and connection. He was a journalist of notoriety at the time. And Churchill was one of the first presidents, I think, of the UK, of the English Speaking Union. We see a lot of film footage at the beginning of these two great warriors, you know, toward the end of life, which is quite moving and quite wonderful to see that old film footage and seeing them all together. I would love for you to talk about your feelings about the knowledge, the relationship of Eisenhower with Churchill in the war years, and then as they aged through the 50s and into the 60s, and how that evolved or changed.
They met first in late spring or early summer of 1942. Eisenhower was a very obscure American newly appointed major general who had been sent by George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, to size up the possibilities for an invasion at an early date. And it was clearly a test of Eisenhower. Eisenhower had risen very quickly from obscurity. And just to give you some sense, he was promoted from colonel to full general. That's about 5 steps in 4 years during the war. So this was early on, and he met Churchill, and they got along very, very well. They hit it off on a personal level, and I think in general, Churchill was always eager to charm Americans. He understood and appreciated how crucial the United States was to the ultimate victory. He also wanted to essentially control as best he could, Churchill that is, wanted to control as best he could the timing of events, and especially the possible timing of a cross-channel invasion of occupied France. So part of what Churchill's doing is wooing Eisenhower and building friendship that he thought he could use to his advantage over time. And Eisenhower was a very political person, a very political general. He's sometimes criticized as not having been a great wartime commander. He didn't win battles by himself on the battlefield the way Montgomery did. But what Eisenhower was a shrewd planner, organizer, and if you will, politically savvy general, which you have to be at the highest level of coalition warfare in a global war. And Eisenhower understood that he needed Churchill's goodwill as well. Now, so they certainly liked each other. And I suspect that, I would say this, they had a stronger personal relationship than Churchill and Roosevelt did. Because Roosevelt was himself a keen, cunning politician who would manipulate his relationship with Churchill to suit his advantage as well. So I think, but that relationship forged in war continued in over the following years. And they remained steadfast friends throughout the remainder of their lives. There's no question about it. Eisenhower felt that the relationship between the United States and Great Britain was the central relationship for Western security and the model for what relationships in the West should be. Right at the end of the war, he gave a lovely speech, short speech, at Guildhall in London, just after the war ended, when London made him an honorary citizen. And in that speech, he noted what united Great Britain and the United States, beyond the language itself, of course, were a common set of values. One might say values of a free and liberal society, which he and Churchill clearly shared. And Eisenhower was determined to defend and felt that it was the West's great responsibility to defend those values against not only Nazi totalitarianism, but the new form of totalitarianism that he saw as having emerged in Europe after the war under Stalin's leadership. Those core values, I think, tied together Eisenhower and Churchill. I would say Eisenhower was more perhaps a man of the 20th century than Churchill was, because Churchill was still, during the war years at least, devoted to the idea of maintaining the British Empire, that is, maintaining colonialism, a subject about, on that point, Eisenhower, I think it can safely be said, was indifferent and did not think colonialism had any chance of surviving, as he made clear when he took over and left the French in Indochina.
So what do you think what was their relationship like in the 60s?
I think, well, both of them are in retirement at that point. And Eisenhower's not in good health in particular. I think they look back with great pride at what they had accomplished. And essentially, they had saved the world from a horrible totalitarian dictator in Adolf Hitler. They had stopped fascism. They had rolled back fascism. And then at the end of the war and beyond the war, they did something else that was very different from what had happened previously. Unlike the end of World War I, where the United States retreated from any ongoing official government commitment and certainly defense commitment to European nations, they built a structure of a security structure in Europe, in NATO, that would continue to keep the United States connected to Europe and to the security of Europe in a way it hadn't been after World War I. And I will credit also Franklin Roosevelt with seeing the need to do that. It wasn't simply Eisenhower or Churchill, but leaders at the end of World War II had learned a great deal from the end of the First World War about the essential importance of maintaining some structure of alliances. And that structure of alliances, I point out, served the United States very, very well for decades after the end of World War II, because it not only provided security for Europe, but it also provided economic access for the United States. The United States embedded itself in a set of economic structures after World War II that were very good for the United States. And it's only very recently that a certain president of the United States decided to question the value of these alliances and suggest that they weren't worth it for the United States. But up until basically after the 2016 election, I think American presidents fully understood that the investment the United States had in those alliances was generally very good for the United States, as well as being useful, important for the Europeans.
You touched on issues. You touched on issues of today and presidents interpreting things differently. Talk about partisanship during the Eisenhower administration. And I know we touched on it with the New Deal politics and everything else, but talk about his own personal brand of partisanship when he was president.
A good way to understand American party politics in Eisenhower's presidential era is a term that was coined at the time, four-party democracy. And we think of America as being a two-party system, but what the four-party democracy meant was that you had a Democratic Party that was split between Southern conservatives devoted to maintaining a segregationist racial hierarchy, more liberal Northern Democrats. Then on the Republican Party side, you had conservatives, even still isolationists in the Taft wing of the Republican Party in the early 1950s, and more liberal Republicans, which meant that you had overlap in the party coalitions. You had conservatives in both parties, and you had liberals in both parties. You don't have that anymore. It's gone. When you look at the voting records in Congress, the most conservative Democrats in Congress are still more liberal in their voting patterns than the most liberal Republicans in Congress. There's almost no overlap. So when you are president in the United States of the United States in the 1950s, you actually can govern in a way that's bipartisan. You can draw on members of both parties to support programs, to support, for example, if you want to update Social Security and expand Social Security, there'll be support for that. Build a national highway system, there'll be support for that too. So you can forge bipartisan coalitions. You can get both parties, senators from both parties will confirm your Supreme Court nominees. Let's remember that Eisenhower puts Earl Warren in as the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And Warren becomes a leading liberal justice throughout his time on the court. That's possible. That was possible then, and we're in a different world today. And I suppose we have some nostalgia for this notion of bipartisanship. I will also add that at that time, bipartisanship extended significantly to foreign policy. There was a strong Cold War consensus in both parties. That bipartisanship tended to fragment with the end of the Cold War in particular and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we've marched to a much more hyper-partisan political environment in recent decades. You can't govern today the way Dwight Eisenhower governed across party lines often in the 1950s.
We'll talk about that nostalgia because we are going through a kind of nostalgia for the leadership of Eisenhower. And it's easy to kind of do that because it seemed easier, though it probably wasn't. But talk about the current nostalgia and also the number of, the amount of stuff being written on his leadership style and everything else. And,
Sure.
And why is that? Well, tell us about that because I think it's very prevalent.
Well, first of all, Eisenhower is credited. I said earlier, when he left office, people thought Eisenhower was essentially a do-nothing president. Historians have gone back and looked again, and they've seen different things. For example, on civil rights, especially early in his term, when the civil rights movement was still really relatively small in scale and of limited impact. And Eisenhower is completing the desegregation of the armed forces, and he's desegregating Washington, D.C. He's actually significantly ahead of Democrats like Lyndon Johnson and John F. Kennedy in his accomplishments on civil rights at that time. Johnson is incredibly backwards on civil rights during this period of time. So when we look at Eisenhower then, we see him exercising quiet leadership on a number of things. He worked behind the scenes to undercut Joe McCarthy and his attack on government officials. And he wasn't about making flowery speeches. Eisenhower was a perfectly gifted public speaker. And some of his speeches read very well now. They don't have rhetorical flourishes particularly, and they're a little quaint. They read as like someone from the mid 20th century. But he wasn't about making speeches. He understood that wasn't a central part of leadership. It was much more important to him as a leader to be adaptable, flexible, to recognize when circumstances changed. And he didn't always get it right. Let's be clear about that. He missed plenty of changes along the way, but he generally managed to maintain a very high level of public popularity over the course of his term because he was able to steer away from certain very controversial issues or limit his involvement in that. Today, leaders are expected to take stands on everything. And in fact, their supporters will demand that they take a very clear stand on every issue, on every question. You can't fudge it effectively. And Eisenhower, in a very different media environment, he wasn't on TV all the time. He wasn't trying to be on TV very often. News programs, there was no cable TV. There were no 24/7 cable TV programs, news programs. He could appear selectively and sporadically in public at moments of his choosing, and he didn't have to respond to every single event. Again, this is a very different world from the one that we're in now. So what's the nostalgia? Well, the nostalgia in part is for the hero model of the leader, the unifying leader who doesn't take particularly partisan positions. Eisenhower had a unique advantage in this respect. He came into office as having been the victorious supreme Allied commander in Europe during the war, a victory that everyone could celebrate. It wasn't a Democratic victory or a Republican victory. Both parties went after Eisenhower at various times to try and be their presidential nominee. That wouldn't happen today, but that's essentially, it says, here's a figure who is seen as being above partisan politics. None of this strikes me as being remotely possible in the current partisan environment. And since we don't like the current partisan environment, it's wearying. It raises our levels of hostility and anger enormously. It's not surprising that we would miss a time when partisanship and partisan strife weren't the defining characteristics of American politics.
Anyway, I wanted, that was kind of a great kind of one-on-one on leadership and the trauma of leadership today, which is so challenging, but it was probably all challenging. It's the way we perceive it. I think it's a good good ending to a conference on leadership, because it does define where we are in leadership. I am going to open this up to the audience now. I see we have one question. I'm going to see what that was. Josh, why don't you read it? Okay.
Yeah. So yes, if you have questions, please put them into the chat and Q&A modules that are present. The buttons for those are at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We already have a question up, but please type them in there and we will get to them in the order submitted. Our first question is from Robin Sinclair from our Nashville, Tennessee branch. And I think you touched on this a little bit when you talked about Eisenhower as a political general, but how would you characterize Eisenhower as a general and his handling of the famous conflict with Patton?
Eisenhower was a planner, an extraordinary planner. He once said something like to the effect of, plans are worthless, but planning is everything. That is, he understood the need to give careful thought to every aspect of a major military operation. And he was better, he got good at it. He became very effective at it. He first came in, essentially he was brought to Washington right after Pearl Harbor to begin the planning process. And when Marshall saw that he could do that, he gave him increasingly larger responsibilities. When Eisenhower then is put in charge of the first major military operation, joint military operation in the European theater, which is the invasion of North Africa, Operation Torch in late 1942, he's frankly not that effective. It's a shoestring kind of operation, very, very ambitious, very complicated, because essentially the United States and the British forces that landed in North Africa would be fighting on French territory, and there was no French government that was supportive of the Allies at that point. The Vichy government had capitulated to the Nazis, and the Germans had occupied France, the rest of France at the time of that invasion. So there's no meaningful Vichy government. De Gaulle is still a fringe figure who expects to be treated as the leader of a major military power, which he wasn't. So all of this is going on, and Eisenhower is also trying to manage a campaign that has very, very limited forces available, with really very inexperienced American troops who performed terribly in the early days of the war in North Africa. They are defeated by Rommel at the Kasserine Pass, and none of it goes very well for Eisenhower. And at that point, Franklin Roosevelt wasn't sold on Eisenhower. They had to have meetings and conferences and talk about what would come next. Eisenhower is never a frontline military commander. He doesn't actually plan offensives. Even the planning of D-Day is turned over to others, including Montgomery, who are more capable of on the operational side. But my goodness, Eisenhower is a tremendous political manager of a very difficult coalition situation. He spoke glowing words about how wonderfully the United States and the American and British commanders and soldiers got along. Not so. They often detested each other. Montgomery's ego was almost unmanageable. The Americans hated Montgomery. The Americans under Eisenhower thought Eisenhower was too pro-British. The British thought Eisenhower was too pro-American. Now, I mentioned Patton. Patton was a brilliant military commander and an exceptionally difficult person to deal with. A massive ego, a temper that was hard to control. He got himself in trouble, as is well known, by his occasional slapping of his own soldiers. He said things, publicly that were difficult to deal with. So managing him and using him effectively was a significant challenge for Eisenhower. They were old friends. They went back a long way together, and that certainly helped in managing the relationship. But it was still a difficult relationship to manage. Keep in mind this, though. In the war in Europe, Patton is actually 2 steps below Eisenhower, not 1 step. That is to say, Eisenhower doesn't have to manage Patton directly. That's Omar Bradley's responsibility. Eisenhower has to make sure that the Allies advance across Europe as quickly as possible. And he chooses, and this has been somewhat controversial ever since, a broad front approach where both the British and the Americans will move towards Germany across basically the depth of France, rather than favor one side or the other and launch a single thrust that might have knocked Germany out of the war sooner. And no matter what Eisenhower did, people were going to disagree with him and challenge his decisions and challenge his competence. But I think we don't fully appreciate, those of us who who look at the war and think about the battlefields and the battles, we don't fully appreciate just how extraordinarily difficult it was to manage this major military campaign, thousands of miles from the United States. Remember, every single American soldier, every plane, every tank had to be shipped across the Atlantic. It had to be brought to Great Britain. It had to be then later brought to France to be used in combat. The logistical side of it is an enormous challenge, an extraordinary challenge, and Eisenhower managed that. It's not clear that anybody else would have done it as well or as effectively, and managed to keep that coalition together amidst all the tensions that arose.
Excellent. Our next question is from Donald Patillo of our Atlanta branch, who asks, was there a rift between Eisenhower and Churchill over the British-French operation in Suez in 1956? My understanding was that Churchill supported it and Eisenhower denounced it, and eventually forced them to withdraw, a major humiliation to Britain. Any insights here?
The question is correct. The United States and Great Britain did have a sharp disagreement about that, and I think actually in the clip that we showed just before we start our conversation, they allude to that cryptically or obliquely in that quote. Yes, the United States, but well, let's back it up for a second. In some ways, the United States was responsible for what happened at the Suez incident in 1956, because Egypt had a coup. Nasser had become the leader of Egypt after they threw out the king of Egypt. Nasser had appealed to the United States for money for building the Aswan Dam project. And Eisenhower was originally inclined to give them the money, but he was under intense pressure from Israel and from Israel supporters in the United States not to give support to Nasser unless Nasser agreed to peace and ending the state of war between Egypt and Israel. So after initially saying, yes, we'll give you the money, Eisenhower backed away. That led Nasser then to nationalize the Suez Canal, thinking that's how he would raise money, and to begin to make overtures to the Soviet Union. When he nationalized the Suez Canal, the British and French went in. And Eisenhower said, this cannot stand. It was clear that the Israelis, the British and the French had essentially connived together to create a circumstance that would allow the seizure of the Suez Canal. And Eisenhower felt that it was impossible for the United States to legitimize this kind of essentially colonial type intervention. And so he didn't, and he put pressure on the British. They were surprised, they were resentful at the time. And it marked the end of a really significant British and French role in the Middle East, because they had been the dominant powers going back to the end of World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And Eisenhower's prize for doing all this was that the United States basically inherited the Middle East. It became our problem.
Our next question is from Jeff Schnabel from our Kansas City branch. It's ironic that as a five-star general, Eisenhower, who was against massive military spending. Today, the US has by far the largest military budget in the world, nearly 3 times that of China. What would Eisenhower think of military spending today?
I said earlier, Eisenhower believes that a country's, and the United States in particular, strength lies in the economy. Interestingly, Eisenhower had held this belief for 2 decades at least prior to becoming president of the United States. Way back in the 1930s, Eisenhower had started thinking about mobilization for war and recognized the strength that the American economy would give the United States. So as far as he's concerned in terms of, if you will, the trade-off between guns and butter, Eisenhower wasn't against guns, but he felt that you had to have limits on the military. Now, what Eisenhower had going for him that sometimes other presidents don't, is that because he had been a senior military commander, and he understood the military, he was not intimidated in the least by the generals and the admirals on his Joint Chiefs of Staff who disagreed with him and felt the United States was showing weakness at various places in the world. They were more willing to engage in military intervention than he was, and he was confident in his own judgment. So now to the question, but let's be clear, he invested in the military, he invested in the creation of the intercontinental ballistic missile system that was a cornerstone of American strategic deterrence at the time. He was not a disarmament advocate. He felt that you needed to have a prudent understanding of how much you should spend on defense and not be panicked into spending more by the possibility of a threat from elsewhere. To take it to your question about China, China is an emerging superpower, and I think the Eisenhower response would be, what we need is strong alliances. We need partners to work with because we should not take on China by ourselves. Those strong alliances should not just be military alliances, but they should bring together the economies and peoples of the countries that surround China that would be the frontline defense against Chinese aggression. I think to make it very specific, Eisenhower would be an advocate for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the trade agreement that Donald Trump backed out of, but that Hillary Clinton also had backed away from. That's exactly the kind of political and economic alliance that I think Eisenhower felt would have been the cornerstone of security for the region.
Our next question, and I think a very fitting one, coming from the new chairman of the organization, Quinn Pieper. How much in your research have you encountered Eisenhower's involvement in the ESU? Is it relevant to your work on Eisenhower?
Because it followed his presidency, I haven't looked at Eisenhower's post-presidential career very much. I do know that Eisenhower he gave a speech to the English-speaking Union in 1951 on July 3rd. That is to say, on almost exactly the 175th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And he was in England at the time, and he spoke to the English-speaking Union. And I guess he alluded to the fact that occasionally, going back to 1776, there had been differences between the English and the Americans, but those differences should not be seen as being anywhere near as important as what tied them together. And he was very adamant that what tied together English-speaking peoples was the general commitment they had to the concept of ordered liberty, is the way I would put it. Because he says, he makes a remark in that speech, as I recall, where he says, basically, we believe individuals should be free to do their own things so long as they don't trespass on the rights of other individuals. He thought that was a core value. And I think he saw the English-speaking Union, and I'm thinking of that speech he gave in 1951, as an instrument for preserving and extending the core values that tied together the United States and Great Britain. Now, the organization has a significantly different cast these days, but I don't think anyone would disagree that commitment to basic liberal values is a fundamental importance to us today, and perhaps much more under threat, I think, in the United States than than in Eisenhower's day. So I'm sorry, my answer to your question is, I don't know too much about Eisenhower's role in the organization, but I do remember fondly the speech that he gave to the organization on the 175th anniversary of the first minor disagreement, if you will, between the United States and Great Britain.
Anyway, Andy, I want to thank you. I think this was really enlightening and has a poetic ending, as they would say, bringing us back to where we all started from, which was Eisenhower's understanding of what the original vision of Evelyn Wrench was. Right now, we have Andy's book, which is the Eisenhower Presidency, which is a series of essays from various scholars on Eisenhower, which we're going to award to someone tonight. So I just wanted to show everyone the book. And Josh, do you want to give it to one of our attendees?
Yes, we randomized the list of attendees, and the winner of the book is Greg Edwards. So congratulations, Greg Edwards from the Princeton branch.
Anyway, it's been really wonderful to have you, and you've been very gracious and very, very open with your understanding and insights into Eisenhower. I think we all feel we feel like we know more about him, and really kind of understand a little bit more maybe about the times we live in too. So I want to thank you again, Andy.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
We invite you back. We will invite you back in another time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now I think we're going to go to Quinn Pieper, the new chairman of the ESU.
Thank you, Andrew and Karen. Extraordinary insight into Dwight Eisenhower's legacy. Are there any further questions from the audience? If not, our evening is coming to a close. I'd like to thank Dr. Andrew Polsky and Karen Karpowicz for the terrific discussion, and I thank all of you for joining us tonight. This evening is also the end of the 101st Annual General Conference of the English-Speaking Union of the United States. As with all memorable events, it takes a team to bring together a conference like this, and remotely, virtually, adds many challenges. I'd like to thank our Executive Director, Karen Karpowicz, and the entire ESU staff for the enormous amount of effort they have put into making this annual General Conference such a success. I also want to acknowledge ESU board member Dr. Julia Vanderwater for conceiving and organizing the remarkable breakout sessions on Saturday and Sunday that provided us so much valuable insight. We have a very exciting year ahead, and in this respect, as the new chairman, I'm very fortunate because we have the opportunity to raise our organization's profiles and expand our reach. And the first opportunity will be January 12th, 2022, when we will welcome Princess Anne to New York. The last time the ESU hosted a member of the royal family was in 1989, when the late Prince Philip was with us at the gala at the Waldorf Astoria. More than 30 years later, we will have the unique privilege to welcome the Princess Royal at a major event. The gala for Her Royal Highness will be held January 12th, 2022 at the Cosmopolitan Club in New York City. I hope many of you will come to New York for this special evening. But thanks to technology, even those of you who would not be able to be with us in person will participate virtually. The program will be broadcast live, so everyone will have the opportunity to be a part of this event. I hope to see many of you on January 12th, 2022. And on this note, good night and God bless.